Welcome to today's deep dive. And as we begin, we just want to warmly welcome you and offer a divine blessing for your day and for the week ahead. May your steps be guided by wisdom, may your work be fruitful, and may you be surrounded by deep, sustaining peace.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for choosing to spend this time with us today.
We really appreciate you being here. Because today, we have a truly fascinating journey ahead of us. We are exploring the 9th chapter of Genesis.
It's a huge chapter.
It really is. And we're looking at it through the lens of some incredibly robust source material. We'll be drawing on the extensive study notes from both the Holman and the NAA Study Bibles.
Right, and we're also pulling from that deeply insightful archaeological appendix by the scholar Kenneth A. Kitchen, which is included in the Holman notes.
Yeah, that appendix is mind-blowing. So our mission for this deep dive is to explore what is essentially the great reboot of humanity after the cataclysm of the global flood.
Right, the whole world starting over.
Exactly. We're going to decode the ancient, powerful symbolism behind the rainbow. We will also correct a tragic historical misinterpretation regarding slavery that has caused, well, just immense pain over the centuries.
A really crucial correction to make.
And finally, we're going to look at some hard, physical archaeological evidence that grounds these ancient texts in real, tangible history. Okay, let's unpack this.
It really is a profound turning point in the biblical text. When you look at Genesis chapter 9, the narrative is essentially hitting the reset button on the world.
Like a completely blank slate.
Yeah, exactly. The study notes from our sources highlight that God gives Noah a command that should sound very familiar to anyone who knows the beginning of the book. He says, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth." Which
is exactly what was said to Adam.
Right. The text is positioning Noah as a sort of second Adam, stepping out into a newly watched world. But what the sources are very careful to point out is that this is absolutely not a return to the Garden of Eden.
No, the original harmony of creation is just, it's gone.
Right, that perfect, unbroken peace between humanity and the animal kingdom is gone entirely.
The environment has fundamentally shifted, hasn't it? I mean, the text explicitly states that a new dynamic of fear and dread will now exist between animals and humans.
Which is a heavy concept to introduce right out of the gate.
It is.
Yeah.
And this seems to tie directly into a major shift in human behavior regarding what they're actually allowed to consume. For the first time in the narrative, humans are explicitly given permission to eat meat.
Yeah, according to the study notes, the human diet prior to this was entirely plant-based.
But now they're stepping into an omnivorous reality.
Exactly. But there is a massive, uncompromising restriction attached to this new permission.
Right, humanity is strictly forbidden to consume blood.
And the theology behind that restriction is, well, it's essential to understanding the entire ancient worldview, why the absolute prohibition on blood.
Right.
In this framework, blood represents life itself, and life, fundamentally, belongs to God.
So you can consume the animal for sustenance, but you cannot consume the life essence.
Precisely. By draining the blood before eating, humanity is forced to pause and acknowledge that they are taking a life, and that taking this life is a concession granted by the Creator, not an absolute right.
That reverence for life is so central.
It is, and this concept, the profound sacredness of life and blood, it builds directly into the next major decree in the chapter, which is the establishment of a legal framework for capital punishment in the case of murder.
It's a really jarring shift, though. You know, we go from God saving humanity on the ark to immediately laying down this incredibly harsh life-for-a-life rule.
It feels very abrupt.
It does. The text says, "Whoever sheds human blood, by humans shall their blood be shed." Why is such a hard line in the sand right out of the gate in this new world?
Because it isn't just about maintaining basic societal order, it's a deeply theological declaration. The notes emphasize that humans are made in the image of God.
Ah, right, the image of God.
So therefore, striking down a human being is not just a crime against a neighbor, it is implicitly an attack on the Creator himself. The value of human life is being elevated above all other creation.
Which made sense in that theological framework.
Right. And the study Bibles make it clear that this verse establishes the authorization to eliminate a murderer, but they also provide important historical context here.
Meaning it wasn't a free-for-all.
Exactly. This wasn't meant to endorse lawless vigilante justice. Other laws later in the text restrict this kind of punishment to proper legal authorities.
So the core principle being established here is that human life is so highly valued and the image of God so profoundly protected that taking it requires the highest possible forfeit.
That's the exact framework the text is laying down.
It's a heavy, solemn foundation for this new world order. But right after establishing these intense boundaries regarding life and death, the narrative shifts to one of the most famous images in human history.
The covenant.
Yes. God makes an unconditional covenant with Noah and with all living creatures. He promises that he will never again destroy all flesh with a flood. And he offers a visible sign for this covenant. Here's where it gets really interesting.
It does, because our modern conception of the rainbow is very different from the ancient context of the text.
Right. When we look up and see a rainbow today, we see a beautiful optical illusion.
A cheerful symbol of hope after a storm.
Exactly.
But in the original language and the cultural context of the ancient Near East, the word used there is simply bow, as in a war bow.
A literal weapon of destruction.
Yes.
That completely changes the framing. The picture being painted for the ancient reader is that God, after waging a devastating war against the corruption of humanity via the flood, is taking his weapon of destruction, his war bow, and hanging it up in the clouds.
And if you think about the physical shape of a rainbow, it arcs upward.
Oh, wow.
The bow is pointed away from the earth, aiming toward the heavens. It's an incredible visual of a deliberate retirement of divine warfare against humanity.
That imagery would have had a massive psychological impact on an ancient reader, and certainly on Noah's family. I mean, imagine surviving a global flood. Every time it started to rain, the trauma and panic would be overwhelming.
It's horribly terrifying.
But by taking a weapon of war and transforming it into a monument of peace, God is shifting the covenant from being a mere spoken promise to a visible, tangible act of disarmament.
God is binding himself to restraint. And the text notes that this covenant is unconditional. It doesn't depend on humanity acting perfectly to maintain the peace.
Which is incredibly fortunate for humanity, because the narrative immediately shows that humanity is still deeply flawed. The chapter takes a really quick, dark turn right after this beautiful covenant is established.
It really does.
Noah, the great hero of the flood, becomes a farmer. He plants a vineyard, makes wine, gets incredibly drunk, and passes out completely naked inside his tent.
It's a stark, almost embarrassing reminder that while the flood washed away a corrupted civilization, it didn't wash away human frailty.
And the text focuses heavily on the reaction of his three sons to this frailty, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Their reactions to their father's vulnerable and shameful state are contrasted sharply.
Right. Ham, who the text points out is the father of Canaan, walks in and sees his father's nakedness. But instead of protecting his father's dignity, he goes outside and gossips about it to his brothers.
He dishonors his father, exposing him further.
Yes, but Shem and Japheth take a completely different approach. They demonstrate incredible respect.
They actually take a garment, lay it across both their shoulders, and walk backward into the tent to cover their father so they don't even look at his nakedness.
They actively work to restore the dignity that Ham chose to exploit.
Which leads to a very complicated aftermath. When Noah wakes up and realizes what happened, he pronounces a severe curse. But wait, if Noah is angry at Ham for what he did, why does the text say he curses Canaan, Ham's son?
That is a crucial observation, and it requires looking very closely at the text. He prophesies that Canaan will be a servant of servants to his brothers. Noah specifically targets Canaan, not Ham. And this specific detail brings us to a heavy, vital note provided by the NAA Study Bible regarding how this text has been used throughout history.
Yes, we need to spend some real time here. For centuries, this specific passage, the so-called curse of Ham, was tragically and illegitimately weaponized to justify the horrific enslavement of African people.
It was used as a theological shield for global atrocities.
Exactly. How did a text about Noah's grandson get twisted into a justification for global slavery?
The study sources address this directly and unequivocally. They dismantle that racist interpretation using the text itself and the geographical reality of the ancient world.
Okay, let's go through that.
First, as we just noted, the curse was specifically pronounced upon Canaan, not Ham. Second, the geographical and historical context is vital here. Where did the descendants of Canaan, the Canaanites, actually settle? They settled in the region known as the Levant.
Yeah, and for those who might not be familiar with that term, the Levant is the area we now think of as the Eastern Mediterranean or the modern-day Middle East. It's the land of ancient Israel, Lebanon, and Syria. It is not Africa.
Precisely. Ham did have other sons who established themselves in North Africa, but the biblical text makes it explicitly clear that the curse did not fall on them. It fell solely on Canaan.
So it's geographically completely disconnected from Africa.
Yes. The NAA Study Bible states plainly that using this text to justify the enslavement of African people is an illegitimate abuse of the scripture. It is a geographical and textual impossibility that resulted in grave abuse, injustice, and inhumanity.
Seeing how easily a text can be twisted and weaponized when it's unmoored from its original context, it makes you wonder how we anchor these texts in the first place.
It really does.
Which raises a bigger question for us today. How do we know the ancient history they are describing actually happened?
What's fascinating here is that we don't just have to take the text's word for it. The Holman Study Bible includes a massive appendix by the scholar Kenneth A. Kitchen on the historical reliability of the Old Testament.
And the evidence there is just incredible.
The archaeological dust has been settling for the last century, and the picture it reveals is astonishing. Kitchen divides the evidence into different eras. Let's start with the primeval history, which includes those incredibly long lifespans of the early figures, like Methuselah living over 900 years.
People usually dismiss those 900-year lifespans instantly as pure myth. I mean, it's one of the biggest hurdles for modern readers. What does the archaeology actually say about that?
Well, Kitchen points out that if you look at ancient Sumerian king lists from the same broad era, they show the exact same literary pattern.
Really?
Yes, they list generations of kings who lived before and after a great flood, and they attribute massive, mathematically expanded lifespans to them. For a long time, historians thought those Sumerian lists were purely mythological, too.
But something changed.
It did. Archaeologists actually dug up physical inscriptions bearing the name of Enme-Barajesi, one of those ancient kings who supposedly ruled for 900 years. The inscriptions proved he was a real historical figure. The literary practice of the ancient Near East at that time was to use these expanded numbers to show importance or longevity. So the biblical text isn't a weird outlier. It perfectly matches the authentic literary forms of its specific ancient era.
That is fascinating. It's using the cultural language of its time. Okay, moving forward into the patriarchal age, the time of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Kitchen mentioned something called the Mari Archives. What are those and why do they matter?
The Mari Archives are a collection of thousands of ancient clay tablets discovered in modern-day Syria. They give us a massive data dump on what everyday life was like in the early 2nd millennium BC.
Like a snapshot of the ancient world.
Exactly. And what they show perfectly matches the pastoral, roaming lifestyle described in the biblical accounts of the patriarchs. But perhaps the most incredible detail found in these archives, and corroborated by other ancient Near Eastern documents, is the economic data, specifically the price of a slave.
This is the part of the notes that completely blew my mind. The biblical text says that Joseph, the son of Jacob, was sold by his brothers to traders for exactly 20 pieces of silver. How does knowing the price of a slave prove anything about the text's reliability?
Because inflation existed in the ancient world just like it does today. The extra-biblical documents from the Mari Archives prove that during the specific sliver of time when Joseph supposedly lived, the going rate for a slave was exactly 20 shekels of silver.
That's incredible.
Earlier in history, it was cheaper, around 10 to 15 shekels. Later in history, say during the time of Moses, it went up to 30 shekels. By the time you get to the kings of Israel, it's 50 shekels, and eventually over 100 shekels in the Persian period.
So the price was constantly changing.
Yes. If a later writer living in the Persian period had just invented the Joseph story centuries after the fact, they would have used the slave price of their own day, maybe 50 or 100 pieces of silver. They wouldn't have known to price them at 20.
But the text gets the 20 pieces of silver exactly right, anchoring it firmly in that specific, narrow historical reality.
Exactly.
It's like finding a novel supposedly written in the 1920s, and the characters are paying 5 cents for a movie ticket instead of $15.
Yeah.
It proves the author actually knew the economics of the era.
That's a great comparison.
Let's move to the era of kings and empires.
Okay.
The sources detail some monumental discoveries here, too. Introduce us to the Merneptah stele. First of all, what is a stele?
A stele is basically a massive ancient stone monument or slab. It's usually erected by a king to boast about their victories or lay down laws. The Merneptah stele is a giant granite slab from the 13th century BC.
Okay.
It was discovered in Egypt and is currently sitting in the Cairo Museum. It commemorates the military victories of an Egyptian pharaoh named Merneptah. And right there, carved into the stone, is a list of defeated peoples. One of the names listed is Israel.
So it's outside verification.
Yes, it is the oldest known mention of the people of Israel outside the Bible, proving they were a recognized entity in the land of Canaan at that specific time.
And then there's the Teldan stele, which was discovered much more recently, right, in 1994.
Yeah.
I know for a long time there was a lot of scholarly skepticism about King David. People thought he was basically a myth, like King Arthur, because there was no outside evidence he ever existed.
That's right. For decades, many scholars argued that David and his grand kingdom were just a foundational myth invented by later writers. But then, archaeologists digging in northern Israel at a place called Tel Dan unearthed pieces of a broken stone monument.
And what does it say?
It was erected by an Aramean king in the 9th century BC. On it, this foreign king explicitly boasts of a victory over the king of Israel and, crucially, a victory over the House of David.
Written by an enemy.
Yes, written right there in ancient stone by an enemy of Israel. It instantly evaporated the argument that David was just a legend.
I mean, it's one thing for a nation to write its own history, but when your enemies are carving your king's name into their victory monuments, that is hard proof. What about the later empires, the Assyrians and Babylonians, the massive superpowers that eventually conquered Israel and Judah?
Their records are incredibly meticulous. The clay prisms and wall reliefs of the Assyrian and Babylonian empires contain lists of kings that match the biblical records perfectly. Kings of Israel and Judah like Omri, Ahab, Jehu, and Hezekiah are all named in these foreign, hostile records.
And they align perfectly.
They don't just appear randomly, they appear in the exact same sequence and the exact same historical periods as they do in the biblical texts. It shows a highly robust historical memory that couldn't have been faked.
Okay, so the archaeology backs up the cultural context, the economics, and the political figures. But what about the physical text itself? A lot of people look at ancient documents and think of it like a massive game of telephone played over thousands of years.
Right, the telephone game analogy.
Yeah, someone whispers a story, and by the time it's written down 1,000 years later, it's completely changed. How do we know the words weren't completely altered by generations of monks and scribes hand-copying them?
That is the ultimate question of textual transmission, and the answer lies in one of the greatest archaeological discoveries of the 20th century, the Dead Sea Scrolls.
These were the manuscripts hidden in caves near the Dead Sea, right, dating back to around 150 BC.
Correct. Before their discovery, the oldest complete Hebrew Bible manuscripts we had were from around the year 1000 AD. So there was a massive gap of over 1,000 years. Scholars assume that if they compared the newly found Dead Sea Scrolls to the manuscripts from 1,000 years later, they would find massive discrepancies.
The ultimate test of the telephone game.
Exactly. But when they laid the texts side by side, the result was staggering. They found that the textual tradition had been incredibly carefully and accurately transmitted.
No huge changes.
There were minor spelling variations, as you'd expect, but the essence of the text, the meaning, and the core narratives remained remarkably intact. The telephone game analogy just doesn't hold up here because the scribes weren't whispering rumors. They were utilizing a rigid, meticulous system of copying and verifying every single letter.
It really reframes how you look at these ancient pages. They aren't just floating theological ideas divorced from reality. They are deeply anchored in the dirt, the commerce, and the politics of the ancient Near East. So what does this all mean for you?
It brings it all together.
It does. When we step back and look at all these sources together, the Holman Notes, the NAA, Kenneth Kitchen's appendix, we see a tapestry of immense depth. Whether it's understanding the profound ancient reverence for the sanctity of human life and the image of God.
We're seeing how easily these texts can be tragically stripped of their geographical context to cause harm.
Exactly. Or simply marveling at the hard archaeological facts that validate the history of these ancient words. These texts still possess a massive power to shape our modern world. They demand to be read carefully, contextually, and seriously.
They absolutely do. The layers of meaning in just this one chapter of Genesis, from the legal frameworks protecting life to the hanging of the divine war bow in the clouds, offer endless material for reflection on how humanity relates to the divine and to each other. History isn't just a list of facts, it's the context for how we understand our place in the world today.
Which leaves us with a final thought for you to ponder today as you go about your week. We talked about that incredible visual of the rainbow earlier. If the ancient symbol of the rainbow represents God deliberately hanging up his weapon of war in order to preserve humanity and offer grace, how might that challenge us?
That's a great question.
How might it challenge us to examine the metaphorical weapons we wield against each other today? In our words, our online interactions, our daily conflicts, are we actively choosing disarmament? And what is our own personal responsibility to protect, honor, and look for the image of God walking around in the neighbors we interact with every single day?
It's a profound thought, and one that resonates just as strongly today as it did thousands of years ago when the rain finally stopped.
May God bless all listeners.